While Europe was at war, Grenada was on the brink. Once French, now British, the island was a dangerous mix of rich and poor, Protestant and Catholic, white and black, free and enslaved. Grenada was one spark away from a revolt on a scale the British had never encountered before. In 1795, that spark came. Julien Fédon, a mixed-race planter, took charge of a huge yet precarious alliance. Supported by the French, they used guerrilla tactics to destabilise and nearly destroy British rule, only falling short thanks to internal divisions and a huge counter-expedition led by General Abercrombie. Tonight, Kit Candlin joins us to talk about the biggest slave rebellion in British history. We address the connections between revolts across the Caribbean, discuss the role of different factions on the island, and question just how close Britain was to facing its own Haitian Revolution. This is Fédon's Rebellion. Up next on the Napoleonic Wars pod.
Hello and welcome back to the Napoleonic Wars podcast. We have a very exciting episode today. It's an episode of firsts. Not only is it the first time having this very special guest on, which I'll introduce shortly, but the shackles have come off. The training wheels have been removed. The young bucks have taken control of the ship from Share Emperor Dr. Zach White. And I'm joined today by the Provost Marshal, Mr. Josh Redden. How are you, sir?
I'm fantastic. This is a monumental occasion. The sun is shining, the birds are singing, everyone's in a good mood. It's not a rabbit hole in sight. This is the first episode ever, as far as I'm aware, without Zach or Luke, I think. So it's a proud day for the podcast.
But we all know, and our listeners will definitely agree with this, that Zach is probably sat shaking in a corner somewhere in fear that we're about to drive this ship off course. However, back to our guest today. So we have, as you heard in the sexy intro from Josh there, we are talking all things about the Fédon Rebellion. And our guest today is Dr. Kit Candlin, a senior lecturer in the history of the Americas at the University of Newcastle. And he's very kindly joining us from Newcastle in Australia. That's not Newcastle up north. He's the past president of the Australian Association of Caribbean Studies. Prior to his engagement at Newcastle, he held a 4-year postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Sydney to study mixed-race Afro-Caribbean women in the 18th and early 19th centuries. And what we are talking about today, a history of the Fédon Rebellion, which will be released later this year, is his latest monograph, and you'll be able to get that through Polity Press UK, which we're very excited about. Right, here we go. Fasten your seatbelts. Like I say, Zach is probably quivering in fear somewhere that we all go mad off piste. But I think you said, Josh, in our little pre-show get together that there'll probably be some less rabbit holes.
Well, we can't promise that, to be fair, once Kit captures our interest. But well, we'll have to see. We'll have to see. Kit, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Thanks for inviting me on the show. I'm really looking forward to telling people about the history that I study and research, and some of the things I've discovered, and filling in a bit more of the sort of the less well-known parts of the Napoleonic Wars, I think. And yet it was a major theatre in the West Indies, absolutely major, with a casualty rate that was far greater than the British forces in Europe, for example. So for one reason or another. So it's a major part of the Napoleonic Wars. So I'm happy to be here.
Kit, can you set the scene for us? Because many people will not know much at all about Fédon's Rebellion. It takes place on the island of Grenada in the Caribbean. So Can you walk us through Grenada in the late 18th century? And, let's go from first principles. Who owns it? How do they come to own it? And set the scene ahead of the year of this big rebellion.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, well, Grenada was a sort of deserted territory in the early 18th century, gradually Some French planters moved there. There was a few Brits as well, a bit of a mixed bag, but gradually a French colony emerged, and it mainly concentrated on sugar, cocoa, and coffee, particularly because cocoa and coffee grows high in the hills. There was a growing number of slaves as well, and it becomes a French colony. But basically, a lot of these smaller colonial islands in the Caribbean were sort of, very frontier territory in the southern Cap, apart from Barbados in the south. All the other places like Dominica, St. Vincent, even Spanish Trinidad, very undeveloped. But with the Seven Years' War, of course, Britain ends up doing very well and gains a number of colonies known as the Ceded Islands. And one of those happened to be Grenada, and this happened in 1763. Another one was Dominica. They occupied Tobago for a short while as well, and they got St. Vincent, the Ceded Islands. Now, all these islands came, as I was just saying, with resident populations of French planters and their slaves. Also, lots of ne'er-do-wells and flotsam and jetsam of the colonial Caribbean. So there was a very much a Catholic French population. There was a population also of mixed race people who were generally free, but they were of color and they were also marginalized as well. And most of them were francophone. They were French speakers. But with the British taking over the region in the 1760s, you get this massive influx of British capital and British planters, and you get a virulent anti-Catholicism, a very powerful Protestantism is on the island. And it becomes quite a fractious place. The British and the French don't get on. The French are marginalized. They refuse to sign the Test Act, so they're banned from politics and government and public office. And this annoys the population because they're still in the majority French or French mixed race people. Okay. On top of this, your British are also bringing in vast numbers of West African enslaved people, okay? And the population is exploding. So by the 1780s, you've got a very separated community of angry French people who are not happy with the British, a smaller number of British people, and we're talking about 2,000 people here. We've also got a large population of mixed race people who are coming to the island from other islands as well. So the population of free people is starting to be dominated not just by French whites, but also French mixed race people. And so this is creating tension. You've also got what would on the eve of the rebellion be in 1795, 30,000 enslaved people. The enslaved community in these colonies was also quite divided. So some of them were Creole enslaved who were born in the colony. They tended to be much more socially adept in the colonial society. They tended to be given positions of power or authority in some way. Sometimes they had a bit of education, that kind of thing. And then you had fresh arrivals from Africa who were more fractious and difficult to control for the enslavers. So you've got this really divided, bitter animosity between these communities, complicated by enslavement and race as well. So all these different dynamics. Now it gets even more complicated on these islands because the white community itself is also divided. You've got lots of poor white people and you've got some very wealthy planters. A lot of the plantations are actually quite badly managed because they're managed by absentee landlords from Britain living in fine houses that they're building with all their slave money, while the plantations are being managed by a lot of these kind of poor whites, right? So we've got a dangerous, volatile mix, and the situation for the French Catholics is getting worse. Now, in the late 1780s, the British are starting to commandeer Catholic churches for the Protestants, even though they don't need any more churches. They're just doing it to annoy the Catholics. So now Catholics, who are still the majority of the free population, have to meet in their own houses. And then priests start getting arrested. This is the situation. It's a very delicate situation. Of course, 1789 occurs, and the first colony to start getting news of the French Revolution is Martinique, the big French island north of Grenada. France has three major colonies in the Caribbean. Martinique, halfway up that great arc of islands that make the Caribbean chain. Just north of that is Guadeloupe. And then you've got the massive colony of Saint-Domingue, which is now Haiti. But in the late 1780s, Saint-Domingue made 2/5 of the world's sugar and about 3/5 of the world's coffee. It was the wealthiest colony of them all. And it had 500,000 enslaved people who'd been brought there in the last 40 years. You had 25,000 mixed race French people who were free, and they often owned a lot of enslaved people as well. And then you had 25,000 whites. So the French Revolution, it comes to Martinique. Rebellion breaks out on Martinique, and then rebellion slowly ferments as well later on in Saint-Domingue. The French planters are desperately worried about what's happening now in Paris. So they're royalists, and conservatives. So they go to the British and go, you got to save us from this rebellion, this revolution stuff. We don't understand it, but it's really bad. And they're going to guillotine us all. It's crazy. So the British go, well, this is a good opportunity to obtain for ourselves a new and expensive colony at the expense of our great enemy, as it had been the case since the revolution. And Britain is sort of debating whether it should go to war or not. And it's still this early stage, 1789, 1790. So the British decide to go and help the French planters in Martinique, and they quickly occupied the island. Right. So Grenada, not too far away, the government is really worried now. They've got a very difficult situation. When the war develops, right, after 1791, the British start moving troops around these colonies, and Grenada starts to be denuded of more and more regular white soldiers. And the government is left with a very small colonial militia, which wasn't very good. And during the conflict, it turned out to be pretty bad, actually. And this militia is made up of just civilians, planters with guns, basically. And their job is to terrorize enslaved Africans. That's what they do. They're not a police force, a terror force. That's the point. But when they're faced with a serious military situation, they prove to be next to useless, as it turns out, which was part of the problem for the British. They had no troops. They couldn't rely on anyone. So anyway, the government, on the eve of the rebellion, a new governor takes hold. He's an old planter. His name is Ninian Hume, spelled Home, and he's from up near the south of Scotland, below Edinburgh, near Berwick. And he takes over. He's virulently anti-Catholic. He doesn't like free people of color either. Now, with revolution in the air, there's information pouring into these colonies for revolutionary material. It's attracting poor white British people. Lots of, as I said before, flotsam and jetsam. Lots of people who float around the Caribbean, in the towns and the port towns. And, of course, the government is receiving this propaganda, and it's scaring the hell out of them because they've got this massive population of enslaved people who are very receptive to this message. You've also got a massive population of very unhappy French people. There's only a few of them who the British can sort of see as royalist loyal people. Most of them really hate the British, and they sort of see this as an opportunity. It also affects St. Vincent as well. And so, yeah, I mean, this is the situation on the eve of the rebellion. I think the only thing I would add to that is, of course, William Pitt and Henry Dundas in London see what happens in Saint-Domingue. They see the success they've had occupying Martinique, and they think, this is a way to deal with the French Revolution. This is what we need to do. We need to go to the West Indies and we need to take, the wealth of France. Okay. And obviously their first site is Saint-Domingue, right? And so this is what became the graveyard of the British Army. We're talking, you know, uh, 70,000 deaths in just a few short years, and I'll explain why they lost so many troops. But nevertheless, they decide that they're going to get Sir Charles Grey and Sir John Jervis, who were probably Britain's most able fighting generals in the very early 1790s. That's arguable, but they were certainly very experienced, especially from the American War of Independence. They fought with distinction. Jervis in the Navy and Lord Grey for the military, and they'd already worked together very well. So it was decided that they would send this huge army, the largest army the British had ever sent, bigger than the one they sent to America, and they would send it to the Caribbean, and they would go conquer basically Martinique, where they already were, but they were also going to grab St. Lucia and Guadeloupe and Saint-Domingue, which had all been either St. Lucia recently dominated by the French, but Martinique, Guadeloupe, and Saint-Domingue were all the major French colonies. So this was the plan. So Lord Grey and Jervis, they go and they decide to strike the Windward Islands first. This is where Grenada is. So the fleet goes, massive numbers of transports, and they go to Barbados. They go to Carlisle Bay, and they're all there, and they gather their strength together, and then they decide on a massive sweep across the southern Caribbean. So in quick order, Grey takes Guadeloupe and St. Lucia really successfully with a massive force. But in April of 1793, so about, a year before Grey's main invasion, a ship called the Hankey arrived in St. George's Harbour, and it had come from the deserted island of Bulama off the coast of Guinea-Bissau near Sierra Leone. There, a bunch of utopian anti-slavers had decided they were going to set up a utopian community on this deserted island. So they go there on the Hankey with all their stuff, and they set up their camp in what turned out to be basically a pestilential swamp. And there's a wonderful book that came out it was frightening, but it came out in 2015, and it's called A Ship of Death. And basically the Hankey was the ship, and they all started dying very quickly because, as it turns out, yellow fever has several variants. Most people are used to either the milder Africanus mosquito spreading yellow fever or the Egyptian strain, and that's the deadly one. And it came in waves into the Americas over several centuries. And the Hankey becomes infected. They decide to abandon this island. You can't believe this is one ship that did this. It killed about 350,000 people at least, this one ship, because it kept on board in its pestilential hold, filled with rubbish and effluents that hadn't been cleaned out for years, because it was an old ship, filled with mosquitoes from Bulama Island, filled with this incredibly deadly and unknown strain of yellow fever. It docks in St. George's because the war is waging in Europe. So the captain, who's the only survivor, and because he was an old slaver, he'd got a little bit of yellow fever resistance like Africans had. And that was a key element to this conflict, is that Africans survived yellow fever, but white Europeans did not, because they didn't have enough immunity, whereas Africans did. And if they're coming from Africa all the time, they're bringing their immunity with them. Even Africans born of immune parents in the Caribbean were immune a little bit. Now, it did kill some Africans, but the vast majority survived. Anyway, so the Hankey arrives in St. George's Harbour because it can't go north into Europe because the French privateers and the French Navy will intercept the ship, and it had valuable possessions on board. So they decide to jump on the convoy that was leaving from Jamaica. And so in order to do that, they tacked via the Cape Verde Islands into the southern Caribbean, and they dock for water and supplies at St. George's. Within 2 weeks, 20% of the entire island is dead of the white population, because they'd all caught yellow fever that had come from Bulama Island that was previous to this completely deserted. So they'd caught this contagion, and the mosquitoes had ridden on the ship, and it was rife. And then from St. George's, which is a busy harbor, it's a beautiful natural harbor, had a lot of ships in it. This was the third most successful colony for the British in the Caribbean in the early 1790s, Grenada. It had behind Barbados and Jamaica, or rather, Jamaica's number one, Barbados, and then it was Grenada. And so 20% of the white population dies, and then the disease spreads very quickly across the whole Caribbean, brought by ships carrying mosquitoes, and it goes to Saint Domingue at the very time that the British Army arrive. Firstly, the Jamaica garrison goes to Jeremy in the south west corner of the island on the southwestern arm. And then more reinforcements arrive from Britain, and they land at the Mole St. Nicholas and down to Port-au-Prince eventually. And the army just goes down now with sickness, and they start to die in droves. So normally, the British Army in the West Indies would suffer about 5 to 10% casualties a year, would die because of various diseases. This is acceptable, and it's not too bad compared to even armies in the field in Europe. So it's wrong to just say the West Indies was the kind of the graveyard of the British Army. For most of the 18th century, it wasn't too bad. It's just that in 1793, Bulama fever, yellow fever, arrives in a virulent strain that wipes out thousands. So the British Army is suffering terribly in Saint-Domingue. The same is happening in the South Caribbean with Gray's army. He manages to conquer Guadeloupe and St. Lucia without a problem, but then he starts to realize very quickly that his army is dying. Literally, by the day, he's losing hundreds. The army, he's making calculations going, we need to do this in 3 weeks because 4 weeks we would lose too many men from disease. So it's directly driving British strategy and policy in the Caribbean. So eventually the French decide that they're going to try and defend Guadeloupe. This is key to the Grenada thing because the French send a 10,000-man army with a 3-man commission from Paris, and they arrive in the southern Caribbean, and the commission is led by 3 men, a bloke called Goyrand, a bloke called Labasse, and Victor Hughes, who is the boss. And he's a very famous man in this part of the world. He's a French firebrand Republican, extremist, I would say. He's very, he's a typical kind of Jacobin of the original stripe. He's a, kind of friend of Robespierre, all that kind of thing. He takes his army, conquers Guadeloupe, starts a big fight on St. Lucia. The British retreat back to Martinique. All of this has happened with Gray's army that was once quite successful at the start. Whilst all this is going on, Jervis and Gray are busy extorting vast amounts of wealth from captured French planters that people in Parliament in Britain were claiming was ransom and illegal because it's an age of prizes and prize money. And that's what these guys, that we've won this war, we're going to take as much money from the locals as possible. We're going to sell as much of their stuff as possible, and we're going to divide up the money. And Jervis and Gray made the equivalent of millions from this short campaign, and it ended in their recall. Nevertheless, they were both elevated further up the peerage about 3 years later, or, well, 6 years later. But nevertheless, this was the kind of end of that. Now, at that moment, Victor Hughes, successful on Guadeloupe, had now created this kind of army of freed, enslaved sans-culottes, and they're going to take this revolution across the Caribbean. And they start flooding Grenada and St. Vincent with propaganda and support. At the same time, there's a conspiracy brewing in the hills of Grenada. And it centers around a group of free mixed race, or free colored, to use the term at the time, families who were French planters. They were mixed race, and, they were a tight bunch of intermarried families. And they lived in the mountains far away from the British in the capital at St. George's, which was British territory. The French lived everywhere else. Um, and they decided that they were going to take advantage of the French Revolution and use it to rid the island of the hated British and take it over from themselves. Now, there is an academic debate as to whether at this stage Julien Fédon, who emerged as a 38-year-old, 39-year-old medium level junior planter, uh, has an estate up in the mountains that the British never go to. It's called Belvedere. And it's quite a large plantation, but it's spread out over several hills. And it's quite a complicated thing right up in the mountains. It's not very valuable land, but that's what a free colored planter can aspire to, in the early 1790s. And he and his wife and his two daughters lived up there in an old French farmhouse, and it was basically a coffee and cocoa estate. And this becomes the headquarters of this kind of conspiracy to overthrow the British. And it's, how are we going to do this? And they're getting a lot of advice from Victor Hughes on Guadeloupe, who realizes there's lots of disaffected people in all of these British colonies, and he can take advantage of this. And he's using, domestic unrest for revolutionary purposes on a wider level. So he's sort of supporting Fédon and sending, encouraging words and promising supplies and regular soldiers and all this kind of stuff. And they decide that the British are incredibly weak, and we can get a group of our best enslaved workers, and we can attack the British one night and kick them out really quickly. We can do this. We can do this. We're supported. We've got friends on Guadeloupe. There's friends on other islands. Let's go. And so Julien Fédon, as I said, is this kind of junior planter. He's terribly in debt. He's surrounded by a bunch of other kind of planters in a similar position. But then you've also got this strange world of white French planters who are more kind of, there's a lot of fear amongst conservative royalist French, because they, on one hand, they're French and they don't like the British, but then they're kind of like the Ancien regime and they don't kind of like the revolution, and they're stuck in this really weird position. So Grenada is a site for this kind of difficulty of allegiance, confusion, because the French Revolution is overturning the whole world. This isn't just Britain and France going to war. This is a completely different ideology. It's a completely different language. So on the night of March the 2nd, Fédon decides this is the time to strike.
As a mammoth answer, and it does justice to the total extent of what happened to Grenada in the 18th century. It's what I get for asking big questions, I suppose. But you paint a picture of, well, the very complicated situation that's arisen in Grenada and in the Caribbean by that point. I want to rewind a bit and ask a question about kind of British rule, because you've outlined all these like demographics that live on the island and their different interests. But if we take for a moment the people who were resistant to British rule, the Catholics, the free people of colour, perhaps some of the planters, what is it that kind of makes them resistant to British rule? Because you can see at the same time in perhaps the Haitian Revolution that folks were willing to be quite flexible in choosing between Paris and London, depending on where they felt their interests were being best served. So is it just the case it was Protestantism that was kind of pushing them away from London, or is it more complicated?
It's a little bit more complicated, but that is the main issue. This is a colony that the British Protestants were encroaching more and more on Catholic rights and now ownership and possession. So they really felt not just threatened, but retreating. That was the case. It was a dynamic loss. It wasn't a standoff. They were losing every year more and more. The British were trying to push the French off the island. You've got mixed race people who want more rights. They don't care if the French or the British give them more rights, but they want more right. They want equality. These are people who own their own slaves. These are people who are quite wealthy. You've also got a lot of British people who don't like the British authorities. You've got a lot of people in the colonial world who go there because it's not London, because they actually think that the French Revolution is a good idea for the rights of man, for democracy, for equality, to get rid of the old conservative order who operated enslavement and locked out most of the poor whites from any kind of decision making. The French Revolution is, and indeed the American Revolution also, is providing this language for people that people are very receptive to. As late as 1778, Lord Macartney, who was the governor of Grenada, sent a letter to George Germain, basically the equivalent of the foreign secretary. And he's basically saying that I got a problem on this island. I got a lot of enslaved people. We don't have a lot of soldiers. We got a lot of French Catholics, but we've also got a lot of poor white British people who are not disposed to our government. That's the wording he used. So it's not just anti-Catholicism, but that is a major plank of it. There's also economics as well. People are seeing, that, their economic situation might be threatened as well. So there's a lot of unrest from different angles as well. But as I said, this relationship between the Catholics and the Protestants is a major factor. There was a lot of anti-French feeling as well that got worse after the revolution. You've also got a lot of refugees coming onto these islands, and repeatedly for the years before the revolution, before the rebellion breaks out in 1795, you've got years of governors complaining about unpatrolled borders, not enough soldiers and Royal Navy, can't control who comes onto the island. It's impossible to police. All the governors talk about this. They can't control the information. So this is adding fuel to this kind of anti-British feeling, definitely. It's important to understand the communication that's going on, both amongst enslaved people who managed to get messages to other enslaved people on colonies and spread the word. They weren't stupid by any means. They were major active, they're majority of the population, as well as the French. So yeah, there's a lot of, remember, those enslaved people don't want to be enslaved. Even the ones that stayed loyal to the British because of the rebellion, they did so really out of better the devil you know, they did it out of fear, but they're not disposed to enslavement, so they don't like the British either. So the British, the 1,000 British residents, including the council, the planters, and the governor, are completely outnumbered by people who don't like them.
I want to sort of look at the numbers a little bit more, perhaps. I think you mentioned that there is 2,000 British, assuming making up the ruling class, as it were, and around 300,000
1,000 white British by the early 1790s, and about a similar number of white French, perhaps a bit more. And then the rest of that sort of free 5,000, if you like, were free mixed race people who a few hundred were sort of pro-British mixed race people, but the vast majority of them were Francophone free people of color. So the figures we have for the population is about 3,000 people in, say, 1789, but then another 900 arrive as refugees at one point, and then there are more refugees arriving. So on the eve of the rebellion in March 1795, the free population of Grenada is arguably around 5,000. Most of whom are mixed race Francophone people. So that's the numbers of the free population. And then there's about 30,000 enslaved, slightly under that, about 28,000.
Okay. And I think you mentioned as well that to the British and the British Caribbean, just to sort of zoom out a little bit, the Grenada's the third most important behind Jamaica and the Bahamas, sort of respectively.
Jamaica and Barbados.
Barbados, sorry. In terms of that value and that importance, what is it that the British Caribbean finds so valuable in Grenada? What's the export? What do they create in there that is so valuable?
Okay, all right. Well, the Caribbean from the 17th century, basically, obviously it's divided up between there's some Spanish islands, French islands, Dutch islands, and quite a few, English and then British islands. And they're all producing, the big ones are sugar, coffee, cocoa, indigo, which is purple and blue dye, rice, and tobacco. These are the main crops that are being grown as cash crops on all of these colonies and in, Central America and in, the southern United States. So these are the big cash crops. The big ones out of this are sort of sugar, coffee, and cocoa. And Grenada, because of its topography, it had lowlands where the sugar grows really well. Sugar grows well in hot, flat, well-watered areas, usually by the coast. It does well in slightly windy environments. Coffee and cocoa are mountain crops, so they grow on the mountains. Grenada is very mountainous as an island, so coffee and cocoa become the main crops for Grenada. But as I said, there's quite a bit of sugar grown on there as well. They did try growing cotton early in the 18th century. The French did, but it didn't go so well. It's not kind of dry enough for cotton. The soils on Grenada are very fertile, so cotton doesn't do too well in very fertile soil. It's one of these plants that need to be stressed a little bit. So that's basically where the money's coming from. It's all about coffee, cocoa, and sugar. And that's what grows well. So in some ways, it's better to be an enslaved person growing coffee and cocoa because you're up in the temperate mountains. It's healthier. You're away from mosquitoes. You're away from, so it's if you had to have a job as a field enslaved person, coffee and cocoa is your best bet. Sugar is grindingly horrible down on the flat plains in the baking sun. It's not a good crop to grow. But different crops have different regimes, like different. It's farming, So yes, it's enslavement, but it's also about producing an arable crop. And so each crop has its own regimen and way of working. Some crops require more enslaved workers at certain times of the year. Sometimes it's quite quiet, and plantations would rent enslaved out to different plantations that were growing different crops. So, for example, sugar, crop over time, sugar has to be cut down very quickly and get to the crushers fast because it goes off within a few hours. So, sugar has to be chopped very quickly. It's very dangerous and hot work. And then you get it into the boiling pans, you crush the juice, get it into the boiling pans, turn it into sugar. That is very labor intensive for about 1 month every 6 months. For the rest of the time, you bring in the coffee crop at a different time of the year. So you'd rent out slaves to do that. But in the towns, I've done a lot of work on mixed race, free women of color who often operated brothels and bars and tippling houses, but they also rented out servants and slaves to work in houses in the city or in the town, I should say. And they, if you need a carpenter, if you need a painter, an enslaved woman in the town who owns a mixed race woman in the town entrepreneur would own a lot of enslaved and rent them out. So, as I said, you've got these cash crops, but you've also got a work regime and a labor force that's moving around as well.
I'm sure not much of that was very much comfort to the enslaved people, though, whichever crop they
Not
were.
at all. No, this
Exactly.
was one of the most vicious regimes you've ever seen. I mean, the
Mm.
death rate was extraordinary. Put it this way, slaves in the southern United States replicated, they self-replicated. The conditions in the Caribbean and Brazil, but particularly were so bad that they just had to bring in more and more enslaved people because your life expectancy was very short.
Mm.
Very
I'm
short.
glad we've kind of settled on the enslaved people to talk about because I want to kind of dive a little bit more into this.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Your big argument when it comes to Fédon's rebellion is
Mhm.
kind of the role of enslaved people has been
Yeah,
overlooked by historians
yeah,
in favor of the free people of color. There's this
yeah.
narrative that it's kind of not less a slave rebellion than you think it
Mm,
is. So can you
yeah.
kind of pitch for us, Kit, what the role of enslaved people was in the build up to 1795 and kind of what makes you characterize it more as a slave rebellion than perhaps other historians would?
Okay, you've got a population of about 28,000 enslaved people, and they're owned by various different groups of free people of various different races and cultures. Now, when the rebellion breaks out, it's mainly led and organized and planned by Fédon and his friends in his mountaintop plantation, which he uses as enslaved workers. He's got about 35 enslaved workers up there, and there's a few more enslaved workers owned by his brothers and his friends, and they're all building this massive defensive series of fortifications in the mountains. And they're using their slave labor to do this. They're using logs of wood, banks of earth, they're creating firing lines, they're building this massive series of 3 defensive levels up a mountain. So the camp of fraternity, the camp of liberty, and then the camp of death. And these are all built by Fédon's slaves. So at this stage, we're not sure whether Fédon wants to free the enslaved or do what Victor Hughes did, which is free the enslaved and then force them to work back in the fields because he needs the money from the crop to keep the revolution going. So this is the great failure of the French Revolution in the Caribbean, personified by both Fédon and Victor Hughes, isn't it? They need the slaves to do the work and fight the wars, but they also need the slaves to work in the fields to keep the money coming in to pay for the revolution. And they never solved this problem, and that's part of the reason why they ended up being defeated. The slaves come into action after the rebellion breaks out. So very rapidly, lots of enslaved join Fédon. And a force goes to the western town of Goyave, another to the eastern town of Grenville. At Grenville, about 11 white British people are murdered in the street. They loot the town, go back to Belvedere, the estate in the mountains. Over in Goyave, which is Grenada's second town, they capture lots of people, take them back to the mountains. Weirdly and bizarrely, the governor is Lieutenant Governor Hume, and he's at his plantation at Paraclete with Alexander Campbell, who happens to be just about the richest man in the British Caribbean, and he lives on Grenada, and he's very wealthy, and he's hanging out, and Hume is complaining about how, delicate and nervous the situation is. He's being spied on by an enslaved man working at the table, who then sends all the information back to Fédon in the hills. So as a spy, there are priests, Catholic priests, who are listening out in the town of St. George's to what the British are going to do. So the island is filled with spies. And a lot of these are enslaved workers. So very rapidly, Fédon is able to attract particularly slaves from French planters to his cause. But very quickly, he loses control of his army. There, he finds that the enslaved who fled their plantations have a mind of their own, and he can't control them. And it's really hard. They're just running around the island, burning all the sites of their oppression, destroying all the crops. At first, it's all right. And they gather up all the cattle and all the food they can, and they take it all up to Belvedere. And for a while, it's quite Republican, and they're quite hopeful. But of course, they're denuding the entire island of crops and livestock, and there's nothing left to eat after a few weeks. Fédon really loses control of this army gradually over the next year. The British are surrounded and they're stuck in St. George's. They're protected by the Navy. They're waiting for reinforcements, but they're basically blockaded. Fédon now controls the whole island. He's got this massive group of freed enslaved workers who are now ex-enslaved, and he can't really control them. They're consuming, about 10 to 15 cattle every day. And it's not a very big island. There's not a lot of cows. They're going to run out of food in weeks. People's starvation sets in. Slaves are wandering in and out of the camp. Fédon, there's arguments amongst the leadership. He can't control the slaves. And in the end, that becomes a real deciding factor for Fédon, that he's not able to keep control of his own revolution. And the driving force behind that is not only his failed strategy, it's also the fact that he can't control this army. I mean, he ends up with about half the slave population joining him. This is about 12 to 15,000 people. He's got to feed them. There's not enough food. Once you interrupt the food supply and the provision grounds are all destroyed, there's no crops being planted. The economy of the island has completely collapsed, and it's just too much for the leadership. Now, the other issue adding to this is that there's a fight amongst the leadership about Fédon's strategy. They also have been promised reinforcements from Guadeloupe and French Republican regular soldiers to take charge and deal once and for all with the barricaded British in the capital. How are we going to do this? Hughes doesn't send nearly enough supplies, and what he does send is intercepted by the Royal Navy. So there's a fight going on amongst the leadership, and whilst all this is going on, the enslaved are just running around the island. Now, what's really interesting is that lots of enslaved just left the camp and went to live as maroons in the mountains, and they just hedged their bets. And this is something that the historian Myoline Kars had talked about during the Berbice Rebellion in 1762. She said the important thing to understand about rebellions, and this is like the American War of Independence as well, is that it's not either or. Most people don't want any trouble, and they want to be neutral. They just want to avoid trouble. And this happens in Grenada. You've got a lot of enslaved. Yeah, we're going to be free. We're going to kill all the British. And then there's a lot of enslaved who just go, hang on a minute. Better the devil you know. We knew the British. It was bad, but this is unknown. And I'm not sure we're going to win. And if we lose, it'll be really bad for us. We don't know what to do. Also, some of those enslaved worked on British plantations, so they speak British and English, and they more allied that way to what they know. And there's a lot of people hedging their bets. So Fédon is unable to maintain his authority. And this is the deciding factor in this rebellion, in that Fédon's authority breaks down over the next year. The British are able to hang on, and they get more and more reinforcements until finally, after lots of disasters and failures, they're able to finally get enough reinforcements to overwhelm Fédon's starving rebellion that has unable to capitalize.
Thinking about Fédon, you mentioned that he is, I think you said 38 years old, a French
He's about
planter.
that, yes, just under 40, I think.
I kind of want to deep dive him a little bit. Why him? What evidence do we have of his background, his previous experience on Grenada, and why do Hughes and the French commissioners sort of pick him? And then looking at the forces that he builds up over that time, how are they equipped? I think you said that the enslaved population is just running around the island causing carnage, really, without any organization.
Right.
How are they armed? Is it a case of hand tools and torches? And yeah, how do we get from a French planter to Fédon being in charge?
Okay, great. Yeah, so Fédon is just under 40. He's married with two children, two girls who are in their early teens. His father was a French jeweler who came out from France in the 1740s and 50s. He married an enslaved woman who he then freed. Her name was Bridget, and they had a whole family. Now, this was quite common on loosely managed French Grenada. There's not people go there to kind of live in sin, and no one cares in the colonial world. This is a place of rapine and debauchery, and it's pretty grim, and you're surrounded by all this kind of stuff. So people and the French are much more loose about this, and because they don't have enough people to populate their empire. So anyway, you can create a kind of population. So in the 1740s and 50s, he goes there. He has this family. Julien Fédon is the eldest. For example, we know that we don't know much, but we know that he was educated. We know that he spoke English, but preferred to use French. We know that he was a reasonably mild planter, but not particularly so. And one of the things that happened to him was that not only is he suffering for being French and Catholic, he's also suffering, of course, for being mixed race. So he's very disgruntled, and he's quite a hot-headed man, and he's quite astute. And one of the things that happened, for example, is he married Mary Rose, his wife, and the British annulled the ceremony because it was Catholic. This is again, so the Catholics weren't even allowed to marry. So he had to marry as an Anglican. When the French took over the colony during the American War of Independence, this also created a great deal of animosity because the French reoccupied Grenada for 3 years and they treated the British badly. Then, after 1783, the French were kicked out once again, and the British came back in and then really started to treat the French badly. But during that time, they'd remarried in a Catholic ceremony. So they were very keen from a very early point as a young married couple to be French, to be Francophone, and to be Catholic, and to be anti-British. So this went on for most of his adult life, really. And so he's found himself in an interesting position in that he's not only the head of the family now, his father's died, he's the eldest brother. He's got a lot of friends. His best friend, or at least his friend, is Charles Nogues, who's married to one of his sisters, and they form part of a group. And there are others like Stanislaus Besson and Joachim Philipp, and they're all part of this kind of community. And they're all quite similar, you know. So Stanislaus Besson was a silversmith from Goyave, and Charles Nogues was a tailor, again from Goyave, and you know, these are sort of artisans and minor planters, and because of Fédon's position, not only as the head of the Fédon clan, but also having this estate in the mountains, it makes the logical place to plan this, because so he's in the perfect position to lead. Eventually, he's recalled to Guadeloupe, which he doesn't go to, but they sack him as the revolutionary commander because Charles Nogues goes to Guadeloupe and says that Fédon's no good and he's running the show really badly. So that's his background, really. And he's this is an explosion in mixed race people towards the end of the 18th century, of which he is a representative. And it happened on all the colonies. And it's a real problem racially for the British because they don't know what to do, because they're free for one reason or another. And they also own, for the most part, enslaved people. But they're also mixed race, which means they have less rights. So, you know, there's always this struggle going on. And of course, as their population is growing in the demography, these tensions are growing as well. And Julien Fédon is riding this wave. He's at the right time, in the right place, with the right number of friends, you know, and it's right at the right time, you know. So he's in this perfect position, really, to take on this leadership role.
People are probably listening to this and chomping at the bit because in true Napoleonic Wars podcast fashion, we love to spend so much time talking about kind of the background and the causes without spending so much time on the actual campaigns and the military element. But
oh, right,
I
yeah.
mean, the rebellion it's called a rebellion for a reason. So I want to ask a question about kind of how the campaign unfolds, I guess, because after rebellion does break out in 1795, and presumably while the rebels have the advantage of surprise, how much of a threat do they pose to British authority? Is it a disorganized guerrilla campaign, kind of waiting to be suppressed?
No.
Or do you,
At the beginning,
think it's more serious?
At the beginning, it was really scary. Panic in St. George's. They realized they were dealing with something very large. They realized they were totally understrengthed. The militia was no good. They had basically about 150 soldiers, 60 of whom were in hospital. You know, they've got some sailors from the Quebec frigate. You know, they've got some sailors in the harbor. They've got some loyal enslaved workers. And they know, and this goes back to Liam's question, which was that basically because of colonialism, because of slavery, because of the militia, because of the French and warfare, there were guns all over this colony. There were guns and gunpowder. It was an armed camp. There were weapons everywhere. And the British in St. George's, the governor has been captured. No one, they've sent word out, they sent a message to Jose Chacon, the Spanish governor of nearby Trinidad, going, "We've got a slave rebellion, the French Revolution is here, can you help?" Chacon sends 60 soldiers. He could barely afford them himself because he's only got about 150 in Port of Spain to defend the whole of Trinidad. And his island itself is filled with Republican refugees, and they all hate the Spanish. So he's totally outnumbered. But he realizes the contagion, as he calls it, might spread to his colony. So he sends soldiers into St. George's Harbour. Meanwhile, the president of the council, who's completely civilian, is a guy called Kenneth Mackenzie. Now, he's actually quite competent, but he's not a soldier. He sends word to British command in Barbados and then into Martinique, desperately requiring reinforcements. The letter in the National Archives is chilling. This is the letter that the acting governor, the acting president, if you like, or the president of the council sends to London. I regret to inform your grace that a rebellion has seriously broken out in this colony and we are absolutely outnumbered. It's desperate. They set up barricades around the port. The port is, so if you've ever, this beautiful town, but St. George's is totally surrounded by mountains. So of course they're in a perfect position to be fired on. There are bases, little forts that had been built over the previous 30 years around the capital. Now, the dynamic is basically that Sir John Vaughan is head of Leeward Islands Command, and they're in Martinique, working out what they're going to do now that Victor Hughes has retaken Guadeloupe and the fighting on St. Lucia with Sir John Moore, who goes on to the peninsula to do well. He's on St. Lucia, desperately fighting Republicans at this moment. Grenada goes, St. Vincent goes. So Sir John Vaughan's now got a problem in that the rebellion, similar to Grenada, but very different in some ways, breaks out on St. Vincent. So he sends 300 soldiers straight away to St. Vincent, the 46th Regiment, or half of them, and they go there. And then straight away, literally 2 days later, he gets this message from Grenada going, we've got a problem. We need soldiers. We don't have any soldiers left. So he sends 200 soldiers. They go, we don't have a general officer. We've got a lieutenant colonel, but he doesn't have the authority to command a campaign. We need a general officer to take charge of the entire military situation, to take control of the island, to introduce martial law. So they send a lieutenant colonel who's acting colonel, who then they promote to brevet brigadier general, and his name is Colin Lindsay. And he arrives from Martinique with elements of the 46 and some artillery. And so immediately he's arrived, he gathers all the soldiers he can and goes, right, we've got to deal with this straight away. And this is the sort of 15th of March. This is 2 weeks into the campaign. The whole island is lost to the British. They're hiding out in the capital. Lindsay's arrived, he's taken charge, and he marches his army straight up to Belvedere. But there are problems. The army starts to disintegrate because a rainstorm lasts for a week. He's up in the mountains, in the forests. He's living in a slave hut that he's commandeered to live in. His army's in tents. It's muddy. There's rain everywhere. The keep your powder dry. Forget that. This is going to be, if it's going to go to a fight, it's going to be by bayonet because there's too much wet. And he knows he can't finish the job. So he's stuck on this mountain before Belvedere going, wow. And then the militia who he's sort of with decides they want to go back to St. George's and, wait for the weather to break. So he allows them to go. But then some enslaved people, and this is where the enslaved come back in again, they go to the British camp and steal all the haversacks of the military. So all the army's supplies, and there's several hundred of them, and they lose loads of their haversacks. The enslaved, the ex-enslaved sneak into the makeshift British camp in the rain and drive away all the mules. So Colin Lindsay's swift campaign to deal with this problem is rapidly falling apart. And his last letter to Sir John Vaughan is just tragic. And of course, on about, I think it was the 22nd of March, he'd been on this hillside waiting for the fine weather to improve so he can make the final attack. He's lost the initiative. He really basically thinks he's lost the war and he's made terrible blunders. In hindsight, he was actually not too bad. But On that morning at 5 a.m., he just walked out of his tent and blew his brains out. So now Mackenzie's going, that's our general officer. What's happening now? The army then streams back from Belvedere, back to St. George's, and it's like, right, what are we going to do? We're back to square one. Everyone's dying of Bullen fever. So this is where Fédon's rebellion is absolutely key, and a number of scholars recently have really explored this, because it's the Fédon rebellion that is the foundation of the West Indian regiments. And by 1802, there were 10 regiments, about 8,000 men, and they garrisoned all of the British colonies in the Caribbean because they survived. And they worked out in desperation that black troops fight really well. And there are all these messages. Now, the British Army had used Africans before in small numbers. In the American War of Independence, for example, a guy called Edward Matthews, who would then go to be the governor of Grenada in the 1780s, he formed a unit called the Carolina Corps. These are escaped enslaved who could ride horses. The British needed cavalry in the Southern campaign of the American War of Independence, and so there were about 600 of them, because the British managed to persuade about 25,000 Africans to leave their plantations to cripple the American South economically, and some of them became soldiers for the British Army. In fact, most of them did, because the argument is that we'll free you if you serve the army. So thousands did. Most of them died of smallpox. Some of them went to Nova Scotia. Some of them went to Canada in the Great Lakes, but some of them were in the Carolina Corps. And when Matthews and the war ended in 1783, he goes to Grenada and takes them with him. This unit is still in Grenada in the 1790s, and they're quite a successful group of armed black militia. But Grenada, because of the situation, has an inordinately large number of government enslaved. These are enslaved who aren't owned by planters, they're actually owned by the government, or they're owned by the military. And they're being used in huge numbers to build stuff. And Matthews is very keen on arming these people. So they realize they're in desperate straits, and they get permission to arm as many trustee, as they called them, trustee enslaved who happen to be in St. George's, because now St. George's is getting a lot of refugee slaves. Because they've run out of food, they don't like Fédon, they've run out of food, so they come back to the British. And this is welcome for the British, because even though the town is filling up now with desperate refugees, both black and white, they've got more bodies to arm to defend themselves. So it's not so bad. But they start to get all the slave drivers, the slave catchers. Grenada's filled with experienced enslaved who, for better conditions, will go out into the mountains and capture runaway slaves. There's loads of them, and these are very well-trained, experienced enslaved. These are the first to be armed. They do so well in Grenada and St. Vincent that the British Army goes, this is a permanent, these people survive yellow fever. We need this to defend our colonies. And they've proven to be absolutely loyal, and some of the best soldiers the British generals had ever worked with. Absolutely brilliant. So you've got, and so this weird standoff occurs for about a year, where there's kind of forays and battles, but the British are in St. George's waiting for reinforcements, and the British are stretched everywhere, so they don't kind of have reinforcements ready, so they have to wait. And then you've got Fédon and his forces that are kind of all in now falling apart, but there's loads of them. So the British are in the hundreds, but Fédon's kind of in the thousands. So, there are some amazing this is the biggest slave rebellion in British history. This is a war that ends up killing 7,000 enslaved and about 1,000 whites at least. So it's huge numbers of losses in this campaign. But going back to Liam's question about most of the senior parts of the leadership, these are trusted enslaved, these are the free colored owners and planters who'd freed them, the people around Fédon, they have the best weapons. They've got the best muskets, they've got rifles, and then it goes down the kind of firearm list until you've got kind of ancient blunderbusses from the 1750s and 40s that are kind of been polished up and put to use. You've got a whole variety of late 18th century firearms, as I said, including the very latest rifles as well, with rifling, hunting pieces, fowling pieces, bird shot, all kinds of weapons, pistols, everywhere. Quite a bit of gunpowder lying around because you've got different captains of the militia in different towns, and they keep a store of weapons that they give out during militia day that everyone sort of patrols around with, and then they put them all back in the cellar. So there are all these caches of weapons everywhere. The ships in the harbor are filled with cannon and gunpowder, and there's quite a few ships now. Even the merchant ships would have, maybe some kind of smaller carronade or something to defend them in this wartime situation. So there's a lot of weaponry. But the slave sans-culotte, the lower order enslaved, this is pikes, pickaxes, sticks, fashioned into spears, all the usual, anything, machetes, anything that's lying around a farm. Anything that's lying around a late 18th century farm that could be used as a weapon. So anything you can find. So yeah, and there's to and fro, and I mean there are some interesting campaigns as well. So for example, the British decide to maintain precariously this post at a plantation called Madame Atchez. Now, Madame Atchez was a small coffee plantation, but it was totally in a valley surrounded on all sides by mountains. It's down in a little gully surrounded by a wall. There's a courtyard and there's a road that goes one way and then the other way. And it's kind of in the middle of that. And this had about 60 British soldiers and a number of, black rangers who were black soldiers who were very good. And they were stuck there and they were there for weeks. And it was desperate. I mean, this was Rorke's Drift stuff. These are, about 100 British soldiers led by a major, a captain, and a lieutenant, and about 3 ensigns. And they were stuck there trying to hold this post while rebels had gathered around the hills and were shooting down, taking them out one by one. There was another occasion where you had a major right with 40 white soldiers from one regiment, or mixed regiment actually, and 260 black rangers over on a post on the far side of the island north of Grenville on Pilot Hill, and they hung out there for 10 days whilst they were attacked in waves by hundreds and hundreds of enslaved and French Republicans and everything. And they hang out, and then one night Major Wright goes, that's it, we've run out of ammo, we've run out of food, we've just got to make a run for it. And without loss, he manages to get his 300 soldiers through enemy lines and back to St. George's in one of the most incredible retreats safely that you've ever really seen. And even people at the time remarked on Major Wright and his extraordinary military skill in managing to extract his force from this desperate situation. But yeah, so this conflict is filled with these weird kind of little moments, little forays out from St. George's that failed for one reason or another, and then you go back. And of course, everybody's waiting for Sir Ralph Abercrombie and his massive army of reinforcements that's gathering in Ireland. So we're all waiting for Ralph and his huge army to arrive. It's promised and it's promised. From basically August 1795, it doesn't arrive until like February, March into the region of 1796, and it's delayed in Ireland. There are storms in the Atlantic, one reason or another. Finally, massive reinforcements arrive and overwhelm what's left of Fédon's rebellion.
It would be remiss of me not to mention, because earlier in that answer you were talking about the early history of the West India regiments, and we do have an episode on the West India Regiment. So if people would like to find out more about that, they can listen to our interview. I think it was with Tim Lockley, which will cover some of that history.
He's the man.
He's the man.
Yeah. So I mean, yeah. So I wrote an article on the nature of fear and complicity, and the particularly unique situation that Grenada was in the 1780s and 90s in the way it used Africans for various jobs and labor, but also for militia work. And it started to slide. You know, you had units being created of armed Africans called the Black Rangers, for example. The Black Pioneers were another, and you also had the Carolina Corps. So you had this. You also had large numbers of slave catchers. I mean, there was one called Corey, of all people. There's a report in the National Archives. I read the letter, it's great. And Ninian Hume is in it as well. And he wasn't governor at this time, but Corey had been caught for murder. He'd murdered someone on the edge of a plant, another enslaved man. But he got given a reprieve, and he was given a reprieve because all the leading planters in St. Andrews province of the colony, including Ninian Hume, who would be the lieutenant governor eventually and be killed by Fédon, they attested to his usefulness as a slave catcher. And they said, don't execute this man, forgive him because we need him. We are desperate for very effective enslaved slave catchers. So Grenada becomes kind of reliant on armed blacks, which is the groundswell behind this West Indian Regiment, which formally was created by Sir Ralph Abercrombie just about at the end of the rebellion. He goes, right, we're going to formalize what this situation, because we've got units going everywhere. So yeah, that's important. I think the other thing I just mentioned is important. Brigadier General Nichols arrives to replace Lindsay, and basically he 3 or 4 weeks later he gathers up the forces and basically does a Lindsay. He goes, let's just take everything we got and take on Belvedere right now. He attacks Belvedere, and the British get into the lower levels of the camp. It's pretty desperate. Fédon has Alexander Campbell and Ninian Hume and 40 other people up in a coffee boucan up on the Camp of Death. His brother gets killed in the fields down below, up in the mountains, and Fédon looks down from the Camp of Death and goes, right, kill them all, that's it. And he'd threatened to do this if his camp was attacked. He's going to kill all the prisoners, so don't attack me. They attacked. And one by one, he dragged them out of the coffee boucan and shot them in the back of the head. And there were 40 dead bodies, 45 dead bodies in a ditch. They got rooted up by pigs and dogs and spread all over the hillside. There was blood everywhere. There were 2 survivors who ended up being taken to Victor Hughes on Guadeloupe. I wrote an article about their experience and what they saw on Guadeloupe whilst they were prisoners, about Victor Hughes and how the Republic was working in this part of the world. But apart from those 2 survivors who were eyewitnesses, everyone was killed and murdered, including Ninian Hume, the governor. So this is a major atrocity. It happens in early April of 1795, so within 2 months of the thing breaking out. And after that, everybody went on this kind of weird standoff. You know, as I said, there'd be forays out, but basically everyone's in St. George's waiting for reinforcements.
The scale and drama of Fédon's rebellion really is like very striking. As you say, this is the biggest rebellion in the history of the British Caribbean. Well, it's the biggest slave rebellion in British history.
Absolutely. Especially in terms of casualties.
Yeah, I love how animated
way
you are.
Bigger than anything else. Bigger than Demerara in 1823 and bigger than Jamaica 10 years after that, you know, which was about 1,000 people. This is, as I said, an entire colony is destroyed. Burnt to the ground, all the sugar works, all the distilleries, the plantations are burnt. The destruction is massive because apart from St. George's, everything is burning. People were saying that they saw new fires lighting up every night as new plantations would go up one after another.
Exactly, and I hope people have enjoyed this episode learning about it, perhaps for the first time. I love how animated you are about this subject. Because we're a podcast, people won't be able to see the visuals, but you're gesticulating and arms flinging, and your passion really comes across, Kit.
Oh, yeah, look, it's just a fascinating part of the world, you know. It's not, it's very complicated. There's a lot going on. There's lots of movement. Women feature in a huge way in this part of the world. You know, when control is looser, you know, in the Caribbean, morals are a bit looser. Women tend to do a little bit better. They start to get into industries where they wouldn't be able to necessarily in Europe. They're able to own enslaved of their own, you know, and yeah, so they form an interesting group as well as just planters and enslaved, or British and French, you know.
All of which will hopefully be covered in future episodes on the Caribbean. Dr. Kit Candlin is Senior Lecturer in the History of the Americas at the University of Newcastle in Australia. This has been the Napoleonic Wars podcast. We will be back. very soon.
Folks, do me a favor. Go review the show. Do it right now. 5 stars, please, and a comment. It takes you seconds, but it sends the algorithm wild and catapults us up the rankings. It's the single most powerful thing that you can do to support the hours of content that we provide for free. Love the show? Never want to miss the latest news? Sign up to our newsletter. The link is in the description, and get regular Napoleonic bulletins direct to your inbox. Looking for a present for the Napoleonicist in your life? We have a shop packed with Napoleonic Wars Pod merch. Again, the link is in the description. And did you know you can now gift memberships to Patreon perks that we offer? So if you want to treat someone to our online course, exclusive meetups with authors, green room access to recordings, and exclusive episodes, head to patreon.com/NapWarsPod to find out more. Much love to all our Patreon supporters who are enjoying a rejuvenated and revitalized offering of the perks on Patreon. As I say, head to patreon.com/the Napoleonic Wars Pod to find out how you can join a buzzing community of like-minded Napoleonic nerds who are enjoying things like courses, socials, a book club, green room access to recordings, early releases, exclusive episodes, and much more besides. Their support is empowering us to vastly increase our output and keep you entertained with Napoleonic nerdery on an almost daily basis. Prices start from just £2 a month, so if you can spare the cost of a cup of coffee each month to support us, it would mean a huge amount and might even fund some more documentary work. Shout outs to our patrons who, at the time of recording in January of 2024, were in the mentioned in dispatches tier: Rob Griffith, Brendan Teeling, Beatrice DeGraff, Lynn Dawson, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Stephen Colson, Jim Getz, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Coughlin, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramas, Anthony Gumbau, Anonymous American, James Fluick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, Ted Andrews, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Carol Dixon-Smith, Roland Shark, Giovanni, Jean-Baptiste Van Merlen, Darla Vincent, Brendan Hogan, Peter Findlay, Jeff Maple, Ian Harding, Indiana Fats, Joe Ayres, Robin Brasher, and Daniel Fieldman. The Admirals, Mark Chestnut, John Haynes, Mike Guest, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Priest, David Maxwell, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Kate Walcombe, Clemens Beman, Charles McKay, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Jason Moran, Tim Pritchard, and Seth Hansen. The Chiefs of Staff, Adam Coslin, the Marshals, Ryan Diamond and JC Kaiser, the Legion of Scholars, Dan Hazelwood and Bob Burnham, and in the Crown Yourself tier, Emperor of the First French Empire Todd Campbell and the Duke of Wellington, Laird Campbell. We'll be back very soon, but until then, this has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. On behalf of myself, Liam, Luke, Josh, and Zoe, take care of yourselves, folks. Stay well, and as always, thank you for listening.